Welcome to another chapter of an old man's rambling, or ramblings, I guess it would be. In any event, where I left off was I just won a case by having the evidence suppressed in a drug case in Denver, where police tried to convince the judge that they could smell marijuana drying in an oven on a third floor apartment from a narrow alley 3 floors below. The defendants were a group of musicians playing at a local nightclub called the Exodus. And by winning the case, I won a few referrals from other musicians. And my so-called tax practice took off. As I mentioned earlier, marijuana enforcement or legality or classification was defined by the tax code, and that was what federal marijuana law was at that time. Well, the war kept going on, and the research money in criminology and other social sciences pretty much dried up unless you worked for a Rand Corporation or something like that. And so rather than go back to the university lifestyle, I decided to stay into law. Actually, I didn't decide. I had no choice. I didn't get any job offers elsewhere. But I've always had this intellectual curiosity about law and its effect on society and how society affects it, and vice versa. So one of the subchannels of that has always been legal policy, which I was able to pursue quite well later on in my career. Anyway, the band member's grandfather had a next door neighbor in Mississippi who got arrested for possession of marijuana. There were two brothers there that were charged with possession. Both of them were non-black and fairly well-to-do, prominent in the community, and therefore got prominent publicity. Now, this was the first publicized white person's case in Mississippi, and they were teenagers. They got arrested, and the family flew me down there to do the case. So I arranged for co-counsel and flew down there to see them. It was the day that the first astronaut walked on the moon, and it was hot as hell in Mississippi. And I was lucky enough to get the only unair-conditioned room in the hotel, Constitution Hotel, I think it was. Anyway, I got up the next morning after a fitful night and hot as hell, etc. And got up in the morning and ordered breakfast and ordered bacon and eggs. And the breakfast was floating on grease. I'd never experienced anything like this. And good old Southern cooking, I guess. And there's this white plop of something over on the side, and I asked what those were, and the waitress says, "Them's grits." So I kind of nibbled at things and got up, went to the jail to see my clients. I walked in the jail, and here's this guy, looks like he was a linebacker from Ole Miss. And I asked to see these boys, and the guy looks at me and he says, "You all must be Mr. Blewett." I said, yes, sir. We've been inspecting you. I bet they were. Well, anyway, we go up this rickety old elevator to the 5th floor of the courthouse, or whatever it was, jail. And at that time, the jails were segregated. So I look over to the right where the white prisoners were, and then I look to the left where the black prisoners were, and I see two white young faces peering out through the black faces, my clients. So I tell the jailer, or ask the jailer, I says, what are they doing there? Now, I'm not going to pull punches here. I'm not going to change the language because that would lessen the impact. And if you don't want to hear the way Southern sheriffs in 1960 spoke, then go to another channel now. But the guy looks at me and he says, down here only niggas sell drugs. And so we figured we'd put them in with their own kind. Well, it was really quite an emotional experience when they got out to visit. But their position or their explanation was interesting. They said it was probably a good thing they were put in with the black people because the crackers would have probably killed them over in the white section. In any event, bail was set and the guys were released. Now I went to the jail about 9 o'clock in the morning and I told the jailer, I said, give me about an hour with these fellows. About 4:30, the jailer comes up and he says, you all done talking to your clients, counselor? And I said, yes, sir, boss, and I really appreciate the extra time you gave me with them. There wasn't much else I could say, actually. So anyway, they went home. I went back to the hotel and decided what to do next. Well, a couple days later, we went to court, and they explained the charges to them, and I conferred with co-counsel on what to do next. Now, I'd been in the South before on some civil rights related things, but I'd never really been around any of the natives down there like this time, and didn't hang out in bars with a suit on, talking to the locals and watching things and observing things. Before, it was kind of a bunch of college students sort of partying down there, thinking we were doing good things and not really doing much of anything but just being there. Well, now it got sort of serious. So reading the statute in Mississippi, it defined marijuana as a narcotic and defined narcotics as anything that had the addiction-sustaining qualities of opium, heroin, etc. And marijuana had none of those. Or anything declared by the State Board of Pharmacy to have certain characteristics, but Mississippi didn't have a State Board of Pharmacy, and anything classified as a narcotic drug under federal law. Well, what I did is there was what they called a removal statute, and you could remove cases from the state court to the federal court if there was a civil rights violation involved. And my allegation for removal was that the state of Mississippi unlawfully and illegally delegated the power to define a crime to the United States government. And it relinquished its sovereign right to define crime or criminal activity to the federal government. Now you've got to realize at this time the government had ordered busing of students, and there was a big friction between the government and the southern states in general over things like education, law enforcement, etc. So I slapped the federal courts, or slapped the Mississippi government right in the face with the federal court removal order, removing the marijuana case to federal court. Well, that lasted for about a month. The district attorney there dismissed the case, called a grand jury, and indicted the clients for the same charge that he dismissed. So I flew down there and filed another removal case. And within the next month, the district attorney in Mississippi had filed a superseding indictment, or another indictment, and I had to go down there a third time and remove the case. Well, at that time, I think the judges and the prosecutors and everybody else got a little bit tired of this thing going back and forth. So the judges said only one more removal the next time you decide where you're going to have the case, and that's where it's going to be held. So if it's removed to federal court, it'll be in federal court, otherwise it'll be in state court. Well, we removed it one more time. And I got into the federal court, and the state prosecutor sort of chickened out. I don't think he'd ever been in federal court. Anyway, we cut a couple of sweet deals for the defendants, and that was sort of the end of it. But in the meantime, I learned a lot of things doing cases in the South, and a lot of differences. First off, I observed that it was easier to make constitutional arguments in southern jurisdictions than in the North. They seem to have a much better feel for the Constitution. Maybe that's because they were forced to integrate their schools or something like that. I don't know. But aside from the matter of race, they're very aware of the Constitution and very strictly constructionalists on their views, which was a benefit to my clients. The other thing I noticed is how cordial everyone was and how polite everyone was, and the fact that a lot of them seemed to be related to each other. The state court judge was related to the prosecutor, who was related to one of the court clerks, and the sheriff's officers were all related to various people in the prosecutorial system. The federal system wasn't quite as incestuous, but it had some. The same was true when I was in Oklahoma on a case. But anyway, I argued to the federal judge. I said, you guys are really curious here. You're arguing about the federal government is imposing its will upon you and invading your sovereignty, but you're willing to delegate to the federal government the sovereign ability to define criminal activity. It doesn't make sense. And the judge says, Mr. Blewett, you're right, it doesn't make sense. So with that comment, I was able to pretty much get whatever I wanted out of the district attorney down there. It was fun. I had a good time. The co-counsel there, my co-counsel there, was very, very cordial and very helpful, and it was great to have a case where everybody treated you with respect. I think the reason they treated me with respect is after a while word got out that I was there at the request of a U.S. senator, and they didn't really know what the situation was, and I didn't feel it was my obligation or duty to enlighten them. I let them believe whatever they wanted to the benefit of my clients. Meanwhile, back in Boulder, hell is starting to break loose. Hippies are all over the place. Locals are aroused because of the hippies. There's rumors of hippies being beaten up. I'll get into that in another episode too. It was just ordinarily a bad scene for everybody when the hippies hit town. It was colorful. They had colorful costumes. The Harry Kirshners would go around beating drums or tambourines, walking through the streets and things like that. You had all kinds of costumes, I guess you would call it. It was almost like going to a costume ball most of the time. But it was disturbing for the power structure within Boulder, and it reflected itself in some of the behavior. For instance, the sheriff's office, when they arrested some hippies, would line them up and turn fire hoses on them because they said that was a matter of health. They didn't want to get any lice or whatever in the jails. They dusted them a couple times. They ordered haircuts, but we did manage to get injunctions against that. But there was a lot of prejudice. I think, looking back at it, the prejudice against hippies in Boulder was much more developed and much stronger and much more insidious than the white prejudice against blacks in Jackson, Mississippi. In fact, I'm sure of it. I saw overt actions against the hippies that I'd never seen, in Mississippi. And the reactions against the hippies, some of them were fierce. The cowboys went running around and wanting to beat them up, cut their hair, and all this kind of stuff. And it was quite exciting there at that time. And it reflected on the community. And most of the established lawyers in town wouldn't take a drug case because they didn't want their fellow Rotarians or Elks or whatever to judge them harshly for taking that kind of a case and not being at one with the community in their prejudices. That was another thing that sort of helped me develop a practice. So within 5 years, my law firm had grown from me to 4 other people, and a bookkeeper and 2 secretaries. So there were 5 lawyers, and we got along pretty well. It was a nice little picnic there for a while, and fairly lucrative, I guess. But there were also a lot of other things that changed after those days. For instance, they would set a bail immediately. They had a bail schedule. Bonds were just for the sake of guaranteeing appearance. They didn't try to predict volatility or criminogenic behavior or criminogenic risk or all those other things they try to do nowadays with voodoo science and fake algorithms and things like that. So typically the length of jail time of somebody, if he were able to make bond, would be about 2 to 3 hours instead of 2 to 3 days like it is now. The jailers were fairly hospitable. A lot of people thought the hippies were amusing, although they didn't lose any opportunity to mess with them if they could. A little bit later, there's a case that I was involved in where a deputy sheriff murdered one of the hippies and 30 years later confessed on his deathbed that he had done so. So it wasn't as light as what I portray here. There's a lot of incidences where the young students, and most of these were young people under 21 or maybe 20 to 25, and they'd occasionally get the shit beat out of them by the locals because they didn't conform to haircut standards or health standards is what they would refer to them. I remember I had a client, he had long flowing hair. He always washed it nice and clean. And he'd been an intelligence officer in the Army. And he and I went into this restaurant on what they called the Hill, the campus area at the university. And they refused to serve us. And I said, why do you refuse to serve us? And he said, because you guys are dirty and you smell. And we both showered probably 3 hours before that. And it was an example of the prejudice. The real the real irony is this soldier that had the long blonde hair had also been an MP for a while before he went into intelligence work. He was an officer and it just got out of the service, and I was representing him on another matter. That was kind of a curious thing. The fact of the matter is that a lot of these people were fairly well-to-do kids, younger children or children of fairly prominent people. I mean, who else could go to an expensive place like Boulder, Colorado and hang out for the summer and not work and not save money to pay tuition and wear funny clothes and drive Volkswagen buses? There was one client I had that I know of. Daddy would fly her out from her home city in his Learjet, and she'd get off at the Denver airport and change clothes into her hippie garb and hitchhike into Boulder from Denver. Daddy didn't know any better, but she was not going to wear her Eastern country club duds to the hippie camp. And there are a lot of ironies that went in on the whole thing. The other thing I noticed was it wasn't until the rotation in Vietnam of the soldiers that we had any hard drugs, anything other than marijuana, show up in Boulder. So probably in about 1969 or 1970 is when stronger drugs started showing up. Other than that, it was mainly college-age students. The whole drug trafficking thing consisted of some students going or driving down to Phoenix or Tucson, meeting up with somebody and driving back with some marijuana. And the structure of this business was pretty much you're in their fraternity houses or boarding houses or whatever, in their local 3-2 bars, and they'd say, we need some weed, and they would draw straws to see who would go down, and they'd pull their money, and one got to be the driver or the procurer, and he went down and got it, brought it back to Colorado, and distributed it. Kind of like what I did with beer in high school. We'd all chip in, and one of us would go get a case of beer, and then we'd split it up when the guy brought it back. So there wasn't any organized crime structure whatsoever. That came later, and it was actually done by the government because they had to organize it and structure it, at least on paper, in order to combat it. Because it's kind of hard to combat crime as a movement when it's not a movement. It was motivated to stop a political movement against the war, but that's how it started. Anyway, we'll be more after another rest period. Hope you guys have a good day, and please let me have some feedback.